Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight we wander quietly into the gilded, faintly ridiculous, and occasionally scandalous private lives of medieval royalty, where crowns, appetites, and a complete absence of anything resembling restraint had a habit of colliding in the most memorable ways. Before we begin, if you find a little calm in these long, meandering histories, you might think about leaving a like and subscribing, though only if you genuinely enjoy what happens here on this channel. And I would love to know, down in the comments, where in the world you happen to be listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. There is something rather lovely about picturing this same slow murmured story travelling to so many corners of the map at once, into so many different time zones, keeping so many different people company in the small hours. With that said, let us make our unhurried way back through the centuries. We begin with King John of England, remembered variously as John Lackland, and, less formally, as very possibly the worst dinner guest in British history. He was the youngest son of Henry II and the younger brother of Richard the Lionheart, which is precisely why the nickname Lackland stuck to him in the first place. Today, John is best remembered for three things: setting his seal to the Magna Carta on the meadow at Runnymede in the year 1205, mislaying roughly half of France, including the rich Duchy of Normandy, to the armies of King Philip II, and somehow, amid all this, finding the time to behave. As the last-born prince, there was simply no territory left to hand him, and his father is said to have cast about for scraps of land, while the elder sons carried off the great inheritances, with startling impropriety toward a great many of the nobility's daughters. His reign, which stretched from 1199 to 1216, stands as something of a masterclass in how not to conduct oneself in high office. Politically, it was a disaster. Personally, it was, if anything, worse. John did not merely take lovers, he took them in the more literal and troubling sense of the word. He gained a reputation for spiriting away noble women, keeping them within his royal castles, and hosting them until they were either married off elsewhere or quietly forgotten. His preferred method of dismantling a powerful family was not the battlefield at all. The chroniclers of the age found his conduct so uncomfortable that even the more partial scribes, men who could pass over floggings and trials without so much as a raised eyebrow, felt moved to write that he was not temperate in the company of women, and that he did not keep his distance from wives. It was to charm the wife, estrange the husband, and then, for good measure, to tax the poor man at double the going rate. Efficient, in its own dreadful fashion. And daughters. In the plain language of the 13th century, that was their way of saying he made the Christmas festivities exceedingly awkward for everyone present. At one point, John was said to keep some 30 mistresses on the official record, which is less a matter of romance and more a question of staffing. Several nobles complained directly to the crown that the king was abusing their hospitality, which is a very polite way of describing a man who could not be trusted around a single member of any household, from the great hall to the servants' quarters. His conduct grew so notorious that it very nearly touched off a rebellion, and not, as one might expect, over taxation or foreign war, but because half the barons of England were genuinely reluctant to leave their wives unattended during a royal visit. One baron is said to have refused to receive the king at all unless his entire household could first be safely locked away. That, in a sense, was diplomacy in its 13th century form. And yet, in the grand tradition of kings, John never once perceived a problem. He considered himself irresistible, though there is no evidence for this beyond his own correspondence, and when one wears a crown, a certain amount of self-delusion tends to come as standard equipment. In the end, John bequeathed to his heirs a kingdom in turmoil, a legacy of deep distrust, and, in all likelihood, several children never openly acknowledged at court. He was the sort of monarch who nudged his own barons toward inventing the earliest seeds of representative government, largely as a means of keeping him at arm's length from their families. Not, perhaps, the very worst king in all of history, but certainly not one you would ever ask to mind the children. Next we turn to Charles VI of France, better known to history as Charles the Mad, who reigned from 1380 to 1422. That nickname, it should be said, was earned over time rather than tossed about carelessly at some drunken banquet. He began his reign full of promise, young, handsome, and by every account capable, and for a time his people called him Charles the Beloved. Then matters took a strange and sorrowful turn. Beginning around 1392, he began to forget who he was, to turn upon his own knights, and, most famously, to believe that he was made entirely of glass, insisting that his servants swaddle him in blankets so that he would not shatter as he walked. It was hardly the image of kingly strength, though one has to grant it a certain grim inventiveness. Now, most rulers who imagine themselves to be fragile figurines of glass tend to withdraw from scandal altogether. Charles was not most rulers. He somehow contrived to maintain a royal mistress, an elaborate delusion, and a simmering civil war between the houses of Orléans and Burgundy all at the same time. His long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, did her best to hold the court together while her husband fled shrieking from mirrors and refused to bathe for fear that water might dissolve him where he stood. Meanwhile, his companion, Odette de Champdivers, was quietly installed within the palace and presented to all as his comfort, which was the medieval court's gentle code for a subject best left unexamined. Odette, to her lasting credit, remained at his side through his most troubled years. She is said to have brushed his hair, listened patiently to his ramblings about glass, and helped ease him into layer upon layer of padded clothing so that he might sit down without fear of breaking. There is little in the record more quietly devoted than the image of a woman fastening her king safely into a suit of cushions. But Charles was not merely eccentric within his private chambers, he also hosted courtly entertainments that could go dreadfully wrong. During one infamous affair in 1393, remembered as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, the king and several companions dressed as wild men in costumes soaked in flammable pitch and capered about near open torches. A stray flame did what stray flames do, and several of the dancers perished. Charles himself survived, thanks to the quick thinking of his young aunt who smothered the flames with her gown, though whatever remained of his dignity did not. For all of this, Charles fathered 12 children, several during intervals of apparent lucidity, or at least something close enough to it. Among them were the future Charles VII and Catherine of Valois, who would one day marry Henry V of England and so entwine the two warring crowns. Whether he reliably remembered all their names, the chronicles do not trouble to say. In the end, Charles ruled France very nearly into ruin, yet he managed the rare feat of folding illness, scandal, and outright catastrophe into a single, tragic, and oddly human story, and somehow they let him keep the crown to the last. We move now to Peter of Castile, remembered as Peter the Cruel or Peter the Just, depending largely on whether one stood among his friends or hid, quite reasonably, beneath a floorboard on his account. He ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369, and his notion of romance was a curious blend of royal charm, consuming jealousy, and the occasional inconvenient act of violence. His early affections settled on a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla, whom he may or may not have wed in secret. The secrecy was rather the point, given that he was simultaneously being married off to other women for the sake of alliances. One such match was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman whom he wed, and then confined to a castle only days later, where she remained for the rest of her days. Maria, by contrast, became the great and lasting fixation of his life. When she died, Peter is said to have wept for days, and then ordered that she be declared his lawful wife after the fact, a decree that conveniently accounted for the 4 children she had already borne him. Peter's passions, alas, did not confine themselves to secret weddings and quiet annulments. He was known to fall in love violently, a phrase that in his case was not the least bit poetic. His court grew accustomed to the disappearance of those who displeased him, from rivals to cousins to the occasional unlucky bystander, and contemporary accounts describe him watching executions from a balcony, while a mistress kept him company, which is rather more than mere eccentricity. And yet the Castilian court was never dull. Gossip flowed faster than the wine, and the line between his affections and his vendettas was often impossible to draw. His feud with his half-brothers eventually swelled into a full civil war, drawing in English and French arms alike. In the end, Peter was killed by his own half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, at Montiel in 1369, in an act of grim family settlement, though his reputation as one of Europe's most aggressively unromantic romantics has long outlived him. If love is indeed a battlefield, Peter came equipped for a siege. From Castile we cross once more to England, to Edward II, who ruled from 1307 to 1327, and is remembered chiefly for 2 things: losing badly to the Scots under Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, and lavishing rather more devotion upon his male favourites than upon his own queen. Let us begin with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood companion, rumoured beloved, and full-time arbiter of fashion. Piers was raised to positions of quite absurd influence, showered with estates, titles and jewels, and made Earl of Cornwall besides, and at the coronation he reportedly outshone the royal regalia and the Queen alike, which is a bold gamble when one's survival rests on the goodwill of nobles. They did not, as it happened, love him for it. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, arrived with a substantial dowry and a set of very reasonable expectations, none of which involved sharing her husband's attentions. When the barons demanded Piers be exiled, Edward sulked, sent him away, and then promptly brought him back, a pattern that repeated until the barons lost patience entirely and had Gaveston executed. Edward was inconsolable, but his grief made room only for a new favourite rather than any reflection. That favourite was Hugh Despenser the Younger, who made Gaveston seem a modest footnote by comparison. Hugh was less an adviser than a second king in all but name, gathering lands, titles, and entire counties to himself, while the rest of the nobility seethed. Isabella, by now transformed from a slighted wife into something far more formidable, joined forces with an ally of her own, Roger Mortimer, invaded England and overthrew her husband. Edward was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, stripped of his crown, and, according to a persistent and lurid rumour, murdered by grim means better left undescribed. Whatever the truth of his end, his reign was less a matter of governance than of personal drama, so consuming that it swallowed the business of the kingdom whole. His error was a familiar one, mistaking the power of the crown for the belief that no one could ever reach him. In time, everyone could. Our final figure tonight is Wenceslaus of Bohemia, who ruled in the late 14th century, though ruled is a generous choice of word. He held grand titles, King of the Romans and King of Bohemia among them, yet his true talents ran more toward heroic drinking and starting quarrels within his own palace. If you are picturing the kindly good King Wenceslas of the Christmas Carol, you have the wrong man entirely. That was a distant and far holier ancestor, a duke who lived some 4 centuries earlier. This Wenceslaus was the son of the great Emperor Charles IV, and began with genuine promise, crowned young, intelligent, and fluent in several tongues. But somewhere along the road he seems to have decided that the royal wine cellar was of greater use than the treasury, and thereafter governed largely from the bottom of a goblet. He became known for drinking sessions that stretched across several days, during which matters of policy were settled somewhere between rounds. His advisers took to carrying flasks of their own, less for pleasure than for survival. He favoured the company of barmaids and laundresses, and now and then a noble's wife, though he seemed considerably more interested in their recommendations regarding ale than in anything else. When one noble accused him of impropriety toward his sister, Wenceslaus merely shrugged and offered the man a drink. Eventually, the princes of the Holy Roman Empire decided they had endured quite enough, and, in the year 1400, removed him as King of the Romans, a decision dressed up in politics but plainly born of exhaustion. Even his own brother judged him useless. And still, remarkably, he clung to the throne of Bohemia for decades, tolerated by his people much as one tolerates a boisterous uncle at a wedding, with weary glances and a carefully considered seating plan. In the end, he left behind a shaken kingdom and a legacy best summed up as a man who ruled as though every day were the morning after the last. Which brings us, at length, to Henry VIII of England, who reigned from 59 to 1547, and who stands as the natural conclusion to any evening spent on royal excess, being, in essence, what tends to happen when unchecked power meets an equally unchecked temperament. Henry VIII of England ruled from 59 to 1547, and he spent the better part of those 38 years doing one of three things: getting married, unmarrying himself, or quarrelling with the Pope over his complicated views on matrimony. Most people know the old schoolroom rhyme for keeping track of his 6 wives: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that little verse barely hints at the tangle of ambition, heartbreak, and outright menace that filled his court. What began as a royal romance slowly curdled into something closer to a cautionary tale. Consider Catherine of Aragon, wife number 1, a Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and a woman of genuine dignity and learning. After roughly 20 years of marriage, Henry convinced himself that heaven was punishing him for the lack of a surviving son. The sensible response might have been patience or quiet reflection. Henry chose instead to pursue an annulment, whether his own excommunication, and, when Rome refused to cooperate, break England away from the Catholic Church entirely. In effect, he founded the Church of England so that he might be free to marry someone new. It was less an act of faith than an act of stubbornness, with a cathedral attached. Then came Anne Boleyn, wife number 2, the woman for whom he had upended a continent's religion. Henry courted her with a flood of ardent letters, some of them rather clumsy attempts at poetry. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day become one of the most celebrated rulers England ever produced, but no living son. When his affection cooled, Anne was accused of adultery, treason, and worse, and she was beheaded, while Henry displayed roughly the emotional depth of a turnip. Jane Seymour, wife number 3, at last delivered the longed-for male heir, the future Edward VI, but died soon afterward from complications of childbirth. Henry grieved her sincerely, which is to say he allowed a decent interval, some accounts put it at 11 days, before beginning his search for wife number 4. That search produced Anne of Cleves, chosen largely on the strength of a very flattering painted portrait by Hans Holbein. Meeting her in person, Henry was distinctly underwhelmed, unkindly comparing her looks to those of a Flanders mare. The marriage lasted about 6 months and ended in what today we might call an amicable, no-fault divorce, sealed with a generous settlement and a politely worded parting. Catherine Howard, wife number 5, was much younger than the aging king and rather less careful. She too was accused of infidelity and executed, though one can hardly help sympathising, for being married to Henry by then meant tolerating his gout, his mounting suspicion, and his insistence that he remained a charming catch, despite being barely able to walk unaided. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, wife number 6, who managed the singular feat of outliving him. She was well read, patient, and remarkably skilled at deflecting the accusations that had doomed her predecessors. By the time Henry died, he had drained the royal treasury, feasted his way through a good portion of the kingdom's livestock, and transformed his court into a theatre of intrigue where a queen's fortunes could turn in an afternoon. In short, Henry loved fiercely, ruled more fiercely still, and left behind a saga so dramatic that people are still setting it to music centuries later. Francis I of France, who reigned from 1515–47, was in many ways the living portrait of the Renaissance prince, cultivated, witty, elegant, and utterly unable to resist the charms of the court's ladies. To his lasting credit, he was a magnificent patron of the arts. He coaxed the aging Leonardo da Vinci across the Alps to spend his final years in France, raised splendid chateaux along the Loire, and did as much as any single ruler to make France a beacon of culture. Yet while his painters painted and his poets composed, Francis devoted a remarkable share of his own energy to romance. His court was renowned, some would say notorious, for its dazzling luxury, but also for functioning rather like a royally sponsored marriage market. He surrounded himself with attendants whose duties, officially described in the language of ladies-in-waiting, often blurred into something more personal. Delicate diplomatic understandings were said to have collapsed because the king had grown too fond of an ambassador's wife. And Francis was hardly discreet about any of it. He is reputed to have told visiting dignitaries that a French king was simply expected to be an accomplished lover, a grand-sounding sentiment, until one recalls that he treated treaties and attachments with roughly equal permanence, which is to say, very little. His best-known companion was Françoise de Foix, a clever, well-educated noblewoman remembered as perhaps the only person able to tease him in public and emerge unscathed. In time she was succeeded, as such favourites usually were, by Anne de Pisseleu, Duchess of Étampes, whose political influence at court was matched only by her talent for outlasting every rival. Even Francis's adversaries took note. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once remarked that the French king was more to be feared in the bedchamber than on the battlefield. He intended it as a jab. Francis very likely received it as praise. And yet, amid the banquets, the flirtations, and the endless diplomatic charm, Francis genuinely governed. His wars were ruinously costly, and his personal tastes scarcely cheaper, but the man never lacked enthusiasm. His reign unfolded as a swirl of silk, spectacle, and scandal, proof that a king could be both a serious statesman and France's most charming liability at the same time, and that Francis would not have traded the arrangement for anything. Alfonso VII of Castile ruled from 1311 to 1350, and beyond the ordinary business of governing a kingdom, he pursued one especially conspicuous pastime, ignoring his wife as publicly and lavishly as possible. That wife was Maria of Portugal, noble, well-connected, and chosen for all the right dynastic reasons, but unfortunately not the woman who held the king's heart. That distinction belonged to Leonor de Guzman, a Castilian noblewoman of sharp intelligence and considerable ambition, who bore Alfonso some 10 children and wielded enough influence to run much of the court in all but name. She required no crown to command attention. She had the king's undivided devotion instead. Plenty of medieval kings kept a favourite, but Alfonso elevated his into something close to a second, unofficial queen. He built Leonor palaces, granted her estates, and brought her with him wherever he went, while Maria was left to preside over royal occasions, largely alone, a queen in title watching her husband's attention drift openly across the hall. Nor was Leonor merely a companion. She negotiated, she counselled, she commanded genuine respect, and she steadily strengthened her own position and that of her many sons, a full-time occupation that, in truth, it very nearly was. Alfonso scarcely troubled to keep up appearances, reserving his time for Maria on only the rarest diplomatic occasions before retreating to Leonor's household. This did not sit at all well with Maria's father, who happened to be the King of Portugal, and at moments the friction grew so severe that the two kingdoms edged toward open war over the affair. Alfonso, however, remained unmoved, and might well have continued in this fashion indefinitely had the Black Death not claimed his life in 1350. It took a literal pandemic to bring the long romance to a close. With Alfonso gone, Maria finally had her reckoning. Leonor was imprisoned and put to death, an act historians describe as vengeance, and which many observers might simply call overdue justice. Alfonso's reign is often remembered for its military successes, but his more enduring legacy may be that of a king thoroughly ruled by his own affections. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, a nickname earned by his striking looks rather than any fairness of temperament, reigned from 1285 to 1314. In public he cut the figure of a devout and serious reformer, forever concerned with morality and order. In private he ran his kingdom rather like a tense and secretive drama, full of betrayals, closed-door trials, and a generous helping of double standards, particularly where matters of the heart were concerned. His most infamous scandal was the affair of the Tour de Nesle, a courtly disgrace so lurid it might have been written for the stage. It began when Philip's daughter Isabella, the very same princess who would later depose her husband Edward II of England, grew suspicious of how warmly her three sisters-in-law were behaving towards certain young knights. There were exchanged gifts and, it was whispered, quiet meetings in a riverside tower. Isabella carried her suspicions to her father, who launched an inquiry with all the delicacy of a battering ram. Two of the princesses, married to Philip's own sons, were found guilty of adultery and imprisoned for years, their heads shorn and their reputations left in ruins. The knight said to be involved met a far worse and very public end, the sort of brutal spectacle that sits oddly beside any claim to moral leadership. Here the tale takes an ironic turn. Even as Philip dispensed these ferocious punishments, rumours drifted through Paris that the king himself kept companions discreetly housed within the Louvre. Some murmured that he maintained a circle of young women on hand to entertain visiting dignitaries in the name of diplomacy. Yet where his daughters-in-law were disgraced, no one dared question the king's own arrangements. A reminder that when you are the one writing the rules, indiscretion has a way of being rebranded as strategy. Philip also had a talent for reaching for religion precisely when it suited him. His campaign against the Knights Templar, dressed up as a crusade against heresy, was widely understood to be a scheme to seize their considerable wealth and cancel the debts he owed them, the medieval equivalent of arresting your banker and calling it the will of God. So beneath the sculpted profile and the pious glare stood a man deeply devoted to hypocrisy and intimately familiar with every hidden door in his own palaces. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and in due course Holy Roman Emperor, was a man who accumulated crowns, the way others accumulate fine goblets, of which he also kept a great many. Reigning from the closing years of the 14th century into the middle of the 15th, He was clever, fluent in several languages, and politically shrewd. He also maintained a private life, colourful enough to make a tavern balladeer blush. He was married to Mary of Hungary, a formidable ruler in her own right, but for Sigismund, the marriage was largely a matter of form. He preferred his attachments frequent and informal, and court officials are said to have lost count of his companions, not because there were an unimaginable number, but because they changed so quickly that some chroniclers half joked they ought simply to be numbered. At court, these favourites were given their own apartments, servants, and, in one memorable instance, a private chapel, an arrangement one may find either touchingly romantic or wildly inappropriate. Sigismund was also fond of disguises, now and then dressing as an ordinary townsman to slip unnoticed into a city, sometimes to gather intelligence, sometimes, it seems, simply to charm the local women while posing as an unusually tall merchant. Remarkably, no one appears to have questioned why this particular merchant travelled with a retinue of attendants in royal livery. And still the man ruled for decades. He launched crusades, presided over the great Council of Constance that helped heal a schism in the church and reshaped imperial politics, all while conducting a romantic life of legendary complexity. One ambassador dryly observed that Sigismund greeted all women as equals, especially in private, faintly progressive in phrasing perhaps, though it hardly reflected well on him. Yet for all his diversions, he remained genuinely popular, largely because he managed to appear every inch the sovereign in public, while quietly presiding over one of the most tangled private lives in Europe. He was less an emperor than a one-man renaissance, strategist, statesman, and scandal in equal measure, and somehow he always managed to come out ahead. Louis XV of France, remembered as Louis the Beloved, reigned from 1715 to 1774, and the word reigned is generous, for he presided over what often resembled a perpetual court entertainment in which the actual work of government was treated as strictly optional. He began with real promise, young, handsome, and positioned to carry forward the towering legacy of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV. But somewhere in his 20s the young king seems to have decided that affairs of state could keep, given how many affairs of a more personal nature demanded his attention. Chief among his indulgences was the Parc aux Cerfs, a modest house near Versailles, that Louis kept for private company. Young women, often poor and pretty, were quietly brought in and just as quietly moved along, in numbers large enough that the palace staff might have benefited from a written register. Yet his most famous companion, Madame de Pompadour, was far more than a pretty face at court. She had, in every practical sense, run France from just behind the throne. Madame de Pompadour shaped policy, steered appointments, and quietly decided 100 small matters that a busy king could not be bothered with. Yet when her interest in the more intimate side of the arrangement faded, Louis XV did not sulk or object. He simply expanded the enterprise. His reasoning was almost tidy in its logic: keep Pompadour for her wit and her counsel, and set up a second, quieter household for everything else. This discreet villa on the edge of Versailles, the Parc aux Cerfs, became the practical wing of the operation, while Pompadour remained the intellectual one. It was organized chaos, managed with the calm bookkeeping of a court that had done this many times before. Each young woman received gifts, sometimes a title, and, once her arrangement had run its natural course, a modest house somewhere well out of view. One might call it France's least official, yet most efficient program of royal apprenticeship. And the Queen? Marie Lesinska was around somewhere, largely forgotten. The daughter of a deposed Polish king, she had married Louis young and given him a great many children before the court's attention drifted elsewhere. Once she had finished bearing heirs, Louis treated her rather like an antique cabinet, too costly and too respectable to discard, but no longer central to the room. The scandal had become so thoroughly ordinary that nobles no longer asked whether the king had a mistress. They asked, with a raised eyebrow, how many this particular week. Even foreign ambassadors filled their letters home with wry notes about the turnover at Versailles, as though reporting the weather. It was, some murmured, less a monarchy than a fashionable pleasure house with better livery. The irony is that Louis genuinely believed himself a fine ruler. Between the lavish balls, the discreet confinements, and the long, awkward silences with his wife, he saw a reign of taste and stability. It was not, in truth, a catastrophe, at least not yet. But it set a tone that his grandson would inherit at ruinous interest. That grandson, Louis XVI, would one day lose his head to the guillotine, an ending arguably hastened by a grandfather who spent rather too much energy on matters below the belt and rather too little on the treasury. In the end, Louis XV left behind a France buried in debt, a court that had stopped believing in its own splendour, and a royal reputation best summarised in 6 words: loved by women, loathed by accountants. From France we cross to Denmark, and to a king who barely qualifies for the word. Christian VII ruled from 1706 to 1808, though ruled is generous. Wobbled through life while other people ran the country would be nearer the mark. Christian carried a heavy burden of mental illness, most likely a form of schizophrenia, and he showed almost no interest in the business of being king, unless it happened to involve chasing servants about the palace with cutlery, which he found endlessly amusing. This made him less a monarch than a royal mascot, kept on display and steered gently around sharp corners. His wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, was a sensible young woman who had arrived expecting something like an ordinary marriage. What she found instead was a husband prone to public outbursts that scandalized the court, given to long, earnest conversations with his own hand, and inclined to vanish during state dinners so he might gallop down the corridors astride an imaginary horse. It is genuinely unclear which gave out first, her patience or his grip on reality. Into this delicate situation stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's personal physician. Clever, ambitious, and keenly interested in power, Struensee soon became the true ruler of Denmark, and, rather awkwardly, the lover of the Queen. Yes, Caroline Matilda went the full length of the melodrama and took up with her husband's doctor, and the king neither noticed nor minded. Struensee wrote the laws, signed the royal edicts, and pushed through a startling wave of Enlightenment reforms, all while keeping Christian happily occupied with puppet shows, mock sword fights, and gentle steering away from anything with an edge. It was perhaps the only love triangle in history in which one corner was simply humming quietly to himself in the background. Caroline and Struensee even had a daughter together, the king's on paper and decidedly not in fact. For a brief season, the two governed Denmark like a rather progressive and slightly scandalous think tank. But royal courts are seldom relaxed places for long. Christian's formidable stepmother, the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, eventually caught wind of the affair and organised a coup. Struensee was arrested, put to torture, and executed with grim public ceremony, while Caroline was bundled off into exile with her reputation in ruins. Christian, for his part, returned to being a gently supervised liability, passing the remainder of his long nominal reign in a kind of padded quiet. History files the whole episode under constitutional crisis. It might just as fairly be remembered as one of Europe's strangest love stories. A king who ruled nothing, a queen who tried her best, and a physician who tried a great deal too hard. Charles II of England, who reigned from 1660–1685, returned from exile with one very clear agenda: bring back fun, ideally accompanied by as many mistresses as a single lifetime could accommodate. Mission, it must be said, accomplished. Having survived a civil war, hidden from his enemies in the branches of an oak tree, and spent lean years drifting through continental poverty, Charles came home to a throne and promptly decided the nation could do with rather less puritanism and rather more music, theatre and revelry. Parliament reluctantly went along. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, he kept a great many acknowledged mistresses, and those are merely the ones history managed to count. The most celebrated was Nell Gwynn, a quick-witted actress who once cheerfully described herself as the Protestant one, chiefly to distinguish herself from the King's Catholic favourite. As branding goes, it was rather brilliant. Then there was Barbara Palmer, made Countess of Castlemaine, who was less a mistress than a permanent fixture of the palace. She lived openly in royal apartments and bore Charles several children, each of whom was duly granted titles and estates, because nepotism, apparently, is livelier when it comes with a wink. Charles made no real attempt at discretion. He brought his favourites to court functions, paid them pensions from the public purse, and reportedly had a private passage built at Whitehall so they might reach his chambers without disturbing the ambassadors. His long-suffering wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, endured all of it with quiet dignity. She bore him no living children, and Charles is said to have remarked that she could not give him heirs but never gave him trouble, a line that manages to be both a compliment and a warning. He fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, and acknowledged most of them freely, showering them with noble titles, while the legitimate line stayed stubbornly empty, as though fate had a sense of humour of its own. And yet the people adored him. He reopened the theatres, restored a monarchy dressed in wigs and colour and easy charm, and made kingship look like a party worth attending. When he lay dying, his thoughts turned not to England or to sober advice for his brother, but to a single request: let not poor Nelly starve. That plea, above all, sums up Charles II rather neatly. Eric IV of Sweden reigned from 1560 to 1568. A short reign, but long enough to leave a legacy of paranoia, poetry, and truly disastrous choices in love. He began with real promise. Tall, handsome, fond of astronomy and the arts, the sort of king who might compose you a sonnet and then explain the movement of the planets over supper. He was also deeply devoted to astrology, and rarely made a decision without first consulting the heavens, though the stars, sadly, never once advised him to calm down. Eric had a weakness for noble women, and not in the discreet, whisper-in-the-garden fashion. He proposed to Queen Elizabeth I of England more than once, and she declined each time, first politely, then firmly, then with a silence so complete it might as well have been carved in stone. Undeterred, he even sent portraits of himself as gifts, the 16th century equivalent of pressing a flattering self-portrait and a marriage contract upon someone who has stopped answering. When Elizabeth went silent for good, Eric lowered his sights in rank, though certainly not in fervour. He fell for Karin Mansdotter, a commoner, and the daughter of the prison guard. The nobility were scandalised, which only made Eric more determined. He married her, crowned her queen, and then spent much of the following year sliding into emotional collapse, imprisoning nobles, and lashing out at anyone he imagined had looked at her the wrong way. His most infamous hour came with the Stour murders, a gathering that ended with Eric personally killing a nobleman with a dagger, while shouting things that left his courtiers wondering whether astrology had finally undone him entirely. By then he was hearing voices, hiding from unseen enemies, and slipping about in disguise to spy on his own council. The nobility staged the royal version of an intervention, which is to say they shut him in a castle and handed the crown to his brother John. Eric spent the rest of his days imprisoned, writing strange love poetry to Karin, muttering about conspiracies, and, one imagines, quietly regretting that business with the dagger at dinner. Sweden took away a few lessons. Inspect your dinner guests for concealed blades, be wary of kings who write their own horoscopes, and think twice before crowning a man who insists the moon is whispering about betrayal. Ferdinand I of Naples, known also as Ferrante of Aragon, ruled from the middle of the 15th century and brought to the throne a rare blend of charm, brutality, and a private hobby that could empty a banquet hall. On the surface he was cultured and effective. He steadied his kingdom, balanced its books, and crushed rebellions with impressive speed. But his method leaned heavily toward the affable tyrant with a taste for psychological warfare, and nowhere was this clearer than in how he handled his enemies. Most kings exiled traitors. Some imprisoned them. Ferdinand preferred to preserve them. After executing rebellious nobles, he had their bodies embalmed and arranged in a private gallery beneath his castle, a chamber known as the Black Room. There he gave guided tours to foreign dignitaries, visiting ambassadors and, pointedly, to men whose loyalty he had reason to doubt. Nothing quite says, behave yourself like a personal walk past a hall of preserved political mistakes. He is said to have described each figure by name, crime, and expression, some posed as if mid-cry, others fitted with small plaques. One visitor is reported to have fainted. Ferdinand, of course, found it delightful. When he was not curating the most unsettling gallery in Europe, Ferdinand kept an equally questionable romantic reputation. He fathered many illegitimate children, a number of whom surfaced later, conveniently equipped with titles and land. His official queen was merely one figure among many, for Ferdinand seems to have regarded marriage as more of a loose suggestion than a binding rule. His favour ranged across noble women and peasants alike, the single common thread being his complete indifference to discretion. One ambassador dryly observed that the king never dined without sampling from several courses, political and otherwise. And still he remained popular. His people admired his strength, his nobles feared him, and visiting enemies, having toured the Black Room, tended to lose their appetite for rebellion with remarkable speed. He ruled for decades, died peacefully in his bed, and passed the kingdom to his more or less legitimate heirs. His legacy, a stable realm, a terrifying basement, and the firm reminder that while some kings build alliances, others simply collect warnings behind glass. The year was 119. Christian pilgrims were streaming toward the Holy Land in their thousands, convinced that the sacred city was at last safe. Beyond the walls, however, the roads were anything but. Bandits haunted the trails, war bands fell upon the caravans, and travellers were killed or carried off into slavery. The dream of safe Christian passage in the East was quietly falling apart. It was then that a knight named Hugues de Payens, together with 8 companions, made a vow, not to a king, not to a lord, but to God himself. They swore to protect Christian pilgrims with their lives, and to do so not merely as soldiers but as monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. No wives, no gold, no estates, only horses, swords, and faith. They called themselves the Poor Fellow, soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon, a mouthful of a name. Yet that final phrase carried weight, for King Baldwin II granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, upon the ground where the ruins of Solomon's Temple stood. From that holy site they took the name history would remember, the Knights Templar. For 9 years they remained a small and unofficial band, underfunded and dangerously earnest. They lived almost as beggars, borrowing armour, sharing war horses, and training with relentless discipline. But their devotion and their strange fusion of prayer and soldiering began to draw notice, and in time it reached one of the most influential men in all of Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was no ordinary abbot. When he spoke, popes leaned in to listen, and in these ragged warrior monks he saw something touched by the divine. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, he helped compose the official Rule of the Templars, a rigorous monastic code fused with martial purpose, and with that a tiny company of 9 became the seed of an order that would reshape the medieval world. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his age, hailed them as a new kind of knighthood, a holy elite who drew their swords not for glory or spoils, but for God alone. It was a powerful endorsement, and it changed everything. With Bernard's blessing behind them, and the Pope's approval stamped upon them, the Knights Templar ceased to be a ragtag band of down-at-heel volunteers. They became a religious order, carrying the full weight of divine sanction. Almost at once, donations began to flow. Young men of noble birth walked away from comfortable inheritances to take the vows. From the dust and heat of Jerusalem, where they had begun as a handful of impoverished knights guarding pilgrim roads, the Templars were rising, holy, hungry, and now, in the eyes of Christendom, unstoppable. What none of them could have guessed was that their greatest gift, that treasured independence from every earthly ruler, would one day be the very thing that marked them for destruction. With papal recognition secured and their white mantles stitched with the blood-red cross, the Templars were no longer merely monks who happened to carry weapons. They were the shock troops of Christendom. The Crusader states of the Levant, those fragile Christian outposts clinging to the coast amid a sea of resistance, lived under constant threat, and it was the Templars who increasingly became the wall that held back the tide. Their rule was severe but perfectly clear. Never retreat unless outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. Pay no ransom. Expect no ransom. Show no fear. Where ordinary knights rode out for plunder and personal renown, the Templars rode with a terrifying certainty of their own righteousness. They were, in the words of their admirers, the wrath of God on horseback. During the Second Crusade they proved their worth. While quarrelling lords squandered their advantage and failed even to take Damascus, the Templars kept their formation and cut clean through enemy lines. Their disciplined charges passed into legend, and it was not skill alone that made them feared, but reputation. Muslim commanders learned to single them out in their reports, naming those white-mantled riders with the red cross as the most dangerous men on the field. Nor did they only fight, they built. Across the Holy Land the Templars raised an iron web of castles and garrisons, strongholds such as Safed and the formidable fortress of Bagras. These were no ornamental estates. Templar castles were engineered for war, with thick walls, gates rigged with traps, and cisterns designed to outlast a siege that might drag on for a year. When other armies broke and fled, the Templars stayed behind, either to buy precious time or to die in the attempt. Their loyalty, however, belonged to no king and no emperor, but only to the Pope, and that made them a rare and unsettling breed, admired and mistrusted in equal measure. A king could not command them, a baron could not buy them. Only the Grand Master, chosen from within their own ranks, could order them to fight or to stand down. In spirit they were sovereign, even as they bled beneath the cross. And they were building more than an army, they were building a mystery. Their ceremonies were held in secret, their rituals kept from outside eyes, their obedience total. To some they seemed unmistakably holy. To others there was something faintly ominous about them, yet their fame only spread until 9 dusty knights had become an order stretching across continents. With fame, though, came whispers, and behind the whispers, envy. The sword of God had grown very sharp indeed, and one day it would be turned against the very men who wielded it. They had begun with borrowed armour and a vow of poverty, and yet within a single century the Knights Templar had become something no one intended, the most trusted financial institution in the Western world. They never set out to be bankers. War made them rich, faith made them trusted, and sheer necessity made them ingenious. It started with the gifts. Nobles keen to support the Holy Land pressed land, gold, cattle, and sometimes whole villages upon them. Rather than simply hoard this bounty, the Templars managed it with care. Across Europe they established commanderies, agricultural estates run with the precision of a business, where every measure of grain, every head of livestock, every tithe and tax was carefully recorded. A brother in England could have funds on their way to support a campaign in Jerusalem within a matter of weeks, a reach that in that century was almost unimaginable. Then came the innovation that made their name. A lord bound for the Holy Land no longer needed to haul a chest of coin across a continent of thieves. He could deposit his money with the Templars in Paris, receive a coded letter of credit, and draw the same sum again in Acre. It was among the earliest forms of international banking. They charged only modest fees, kept meticulous ledgers, and never once defaulted. They guarded the French crown jewels, oversaw the finances of the papacy, funded crusades, and paid the ransoms of captured men. On occasion they even lent to the very monarchs who would one day plot their ruin. For all this wealth, they made no show of it. They wore no silk, dripped with no gold, their churches were plain and their robes humble. Yet beneath that austerity lay an empire of vaults, ledgers, and armoured wagons, an invisible hand resting on nearly every economy in Europe. And still they refused the word banker. They were monks, they insisted, and everything they did was done in the service of God. But the more gold they moved, the more enemies they gathered. The Church looked away, since the Templars answered to the Pope alone. Kings, however, grew uneasy. They owed the order fortunes, and they could not control it. What had begun as a mission to protect pilgrims had become something stranger still. Warriors without a battlefield, monks without a monastery, bankers without a kingdom. As their coffers grew heavier, so did the suspicion around them. Power without oversight is precisely the thing that makes kings reach for their knives. For all their might, the Templars were slowly losing the larger war. The Crusader states, known as Outremer, the land beyond the sea, were castles built on sand, battered without pause by a resurgent Islamic world. At the head of that rising tide stood Saladin, the brilliant Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Where the Crusader lords were fractious and often petty, Saladin was a unifier, and he pursued a single ambition: to take back Jerusalem. In the year 1187 he achieved it, at the Battle of Hattin. The Templars were there, fighting to the last, but they were outmaneuvered, surrounded, and crushed beneath a merciless sun. The Christian army was destroyed. Saladin took hundreds of knights captive, and most he spared for ransom. But for the Templars he made an exception, ordering nearly all of them put to death. He judged them simply too dangerous to leave alive. The fall of Jerusalem was not merely a military defeat, but a spiritual wound. The city they had sworn to defend was gone, the Holy Sepulchre back in Muslim hands, and with it the Templars' original purpose began quietly to crumble. Still, they rallied. The Third Crusade brought fresh armies and Richard the Lionheart, who respected the Templars and leaned on them heavily in the field. Even he, though, could not win Jerusalem back. Over the century that followed, the Crusader states shrank like dying embers, city after city slipping away. Antioch, then Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291, the last great Templar stronghold in the Holy Land. They withdrew to Cyprus, where they raised new headquarters and tried to hold on to their relevance, but something essential had gone out of them. They were warriors still, yet the land they had existed to defend was lost. What, then, were they fighting for? Their castles stood empty, their legends gathered dust, and the iron discipline that had been their pride began to soften. Meanwhile, rival orders such as the Hospitallers gained ground, and accusations of pride, corruption, and arrogance trailed the Templars across Europe. Some muttered that they had grown too rich and too secretive, others that they hoarded relics, and dangerous ones at that. The East had shaped them, hardened them, and finally broken them, and now, cut loose from it, they drifted. They still held their wealth, their network, their aura of power, but they had lost the one thing that made them necessary. A sword without a war, a brotherhood without a crusade, and, watching from the shadows, powerful men who had noticed. By the opening of the 14th century, the Knights Templar were rich, feared, and powerful still, yet for the first time in their history they were also, in a word, irrelevant. The Holy Land was lost. No new crusade loomed on the horizon, and they had become a military order with no war, a religious order with no clear mission, and a financial power that bowed to no crown. That combination made them a target, and no one regarded them with more suspicion and appetite than King Philip IV of France, remembered as Philip the Fair. The name spoke to his looks, not his sense of justice. He was deep in debt, all but bankrupt from his wars with England and Flanders, and the Templars happened to be among his creditors. He had borrowed vast sums from them to pay his armies and hold his throne, and Philip loathed being beholden to men he could not command. Worse still, the order stood outside his reach entirely, answering only to the Pope, holding rich lands in France, yet paying the king not a penny in tax, keeping their own fortresses, their own courts, their own soldiers. To Philip, they were an intolerable state within his state, untouchable, immovable, and unbearably wealthy. So he began, quietly, to plan. His propaganda machine went to work. Rumours crept outward that the Templars worshipped idols, spat upon the cross, and performed unspeakable rites of initiation. There was no evidence, only whispers, but in a superstitious age, whispers were more than enough. He pressed his pliable Pope, Clement V, to open an inquiry, and when Clement hesitated, Philip declined to wait. In secret, he arranged one of the most coordinated mass arrests the medieval world had ever seen, fixing a date, mustering his soldiers, and readying his interrogators. On a cold Friday morning in October of 1307, Friday the 13th, he struck. Across the whole of France, Templar knights were seized, questioned, imprisoned, and put to torment. Confessions were extracted. Some men broke within hours, others held out until their bodies failed them. It was treason, dressed in the robes of holy justice, and it worked. A public that had once revered them began to turn, and the Pope, cornered and humiliated, found no room to move. The tide had shifted, not on any battlefield, but in the quieter arena of politics, and the warrior monks who had once thundered into enemy lines now sat chained in dungeons, charged with sins that no sword could parry. The 13th of October 1307 is the day that fixed Friday the 13th in the Western imagination as a date of dread. At dawn, in every corner of the realm, armed men moved without a sound, their orders plain: arrest every Templar you can find, offer no warning, permit no resistance. The king's justice had arrived. With warrants sealed in secrecy, thousands of knights were dragged from their beds, some still in armour, others at their prayers. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was taken in Paris, betrayed by the very kingdom whose crown jewels he had once been trusted to guard. Commanderies across town and countryside were raided, their vaults forced open, their libraries carried off. The charges were lurid beyond belief: heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, unnatural acts, dark rituals, most of it invented outright by Philip's lawyers. Yet, in an age steeped in fear and religious zeal, the accusations did not need to be true, they needed only to be believable. And the Templars were answered with fire and iron. Torture chambers came alive across France, and men were stretched and burned and broken until their confessions were wrung from them. They admitted to whatever their inquisitors wished, that they had denied Christ, that they had venerated a severed head named Baphomet, that they exchanged secret kisses in hidden ceremonies. Under agony past bearing, even Grand Master de Molay confessed, only to withdraw the confession afterward. It was theatre dressed as justice, a king destroying his creditors by charging them with sins so monstrous that no one dared rise to their defence. Pope Clement V was left humiliated. He had meant to mediate, but Philip had moved too fast and too ruthlessly, and, backed into a corner, Clement ordered an inquiry of his own. Beyond France, the reception was cooler. In England and in Spain, the authorities hesitated, and in many places the charges were quietly dismissed and the accused set free. Within France, though, the machinery of condemnation ground steadily on. Philip seized their wealth, though a great deal of it simply vanished. Some whispered the Templars had spirited their treasure away in the night. Others swore it was never found at all. Still others insisted the true treasure had never been gold, but knowledge, secrets, sacred relics, perhaps the Holy Grail, perhaps the Ark of the Covenant. Whatever the truth of it, the damage was beyond undoing. The Templars were no longer a brotherhood. They were fugitives, prisoners, dead men still walking. The king had struck his blow, not with armies, but with ink, with fire, and with lies, and the world would never again look upon the Red Cross in quite the same way. By the year 1312, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Knights Templar, who had once stood as the wealthiest and most feared military order in all of Christendom, had been ground down into hollow-eyed prisoners waiting in cold cells. Bowing to relentless pressure from King Philip IV of France, Pope Clement V dissolved the order at the Council of Vienne in March of 1312, issuing the papal bull Vox in Excelso, which quietly stripped the knights of their titles, their lands, and the very name they had carried across 2 centuries. The confessions extracted from them, coaxed out on the rack and through long deprivation, were now paraded as proof of their guilt. The paperwork required to justify what was already decided, and what was decided was erasure of crusade. On parchment, the Templars simply ceased to exist. The Holy See was careful to frame the decision not as a verdict of condemnation, but as an act of prudence, a measure taken to spare the Church any further embarrassment. In truth, it was a political killing carried out in the vestments of religion, an execution signed with a ceremonial seal. The order's estates, its manors and farms and fortresses, were officially handed over to the rival Knights Hospitaller. Yet not everything survived the transfer. A great portion of the Templar fortune, the coin and treasure, the account books, the relics people only whispered about, seemed to melt away between one owner and the next. Some insisted it had been buried or spirited off before the arrests. Others were certain it had been quietly funneled into Philip's own royal coffers, which were, conveniently, always empty. Whatever the truth, the sprawling financial machine the Templars had built dissolved like smoke over a snuffed candle, and it left behind nothing but questions that would outlast everyone who had asked them. But the story had one last scene to play. In 1314, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, who by then had endured 7 long years of imprisonment, was brought out onto a scaffold in the heart of Paris. He was to die beside Geoffroy de Charnay, another of the order's senior officers. Both men had withdrawn the confessions once torn from them, declaring to the very last that the order was innocent of the charges laid against it. For that stubborn insistence, they were sentenced to burn. They were bound to a stake erected on a small island in the middle of the Seine, within sight of the great cathedral. As the flames climbed, de Molay is said to have called out through the smoke, summoning God to sit in judgment over the men who had condemned him. Legend records that he cursed both King Philip and Pope Clement by name, promising that each of them would be dead before the year was out. And, as it happened, they were. Clement was carried off by illness within roughly a month. Philip followed later that same year, dying suddenly and without any obvious warning after a fall from his horse. Some murmured that heaven had delivered its verdict. Others shrugged and called it nothing more than coincidence. But the tale took hold and refused to let go. The Templars had gone to their deaths cursing their killers, and, the story went, the heavens had been listening. With that, the last true voice of the Knights Templar fell silent in the fire. Their history did not end on a battlefield, as such an order might have expected, but in betrayal, in dungeons, and in flame. And yet, in the very moment they were struck from the map, their legend was only beginning to put down roots. The fires that consumed the Templars burned out soon enough, but the embers of their memory glowed brighter than the flames ever had. With the order abolished, its castles confiscated and its leaders reduced to ash, it seemed the matter was closed. Instead, something curious happened. Rather than fading quietly from memory, the Knights Templar underwent a strange transformation, changing in the popular imagination from disgraced fighting monks into timeless emblems of secrecy and hidden power. The very silence that had once shielded them now became fertile ground for rumour. Where had their treasure gone? What had become of their scrolls, their relics, their supposed store of forbidden knowledge? Some believed the Templars had smuggled the Holy Grail to safety before the first arrests. Others whispered that they had concealed the Ark of the Covenant, or that they secretly guarded the living descendants of Jesus himself. There was no evidence for any of it, only shadow and suggestion. But in the medieval mind, shadow was more than enough to build a legend upon. Then arose the notion that the Templars had never truly vanished, that they had merely gone underground. Officially dissolved they may have been, but a great many former knights simply melted back into ordinary society. Some took vows in other monastic orders, some sold their swords as mercenaries. But others, so the stories claimed, went into hiding, forming secret brotherhoods that preserved the old rituals and guarded the old relics in silence, patiently waiting for a day that never seemed to come. In the centuries that followed, those quiet rumours ripened into full-blown myth. The Templars were credited, or blamed, for nearly everything, from the raising of the great Gothic cathedrals to the founding of Freemasonry. Conspiracy theories multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. The Templars, it was said, secretly controlled the banks, the thrones, and the revolutions of Europe. They had never really been defeated at all, only disguised. Behind every turning point in history, some hidden hand in a white mantle was said to be nudging events toward a chosen end. Popular culture, needless to say, poured fuel on the fire. The Templars turned up in novels, in films, and in video games, cast sometimes as noble heroes and sometimes as sinister villains. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code reimagined them as the keepers of sacred bloodlines. The Assassin's Creed games recast them as a global cabal, forever pulling the strings of civilization. Each fresh retelling bent the truth a little further, and each one fed the appetite for more. In reality, the Templars had been flesh and blood, brave without question and flawed without doubt, religious warriors who had tried to fuse the humility of the cloister with the brutality of the battlefield, and who ultimately paid a terrible price for it. But myths endure precisely because they offer what plain history so often cannot: tidy answers, hidden meaning, and the thrill of a mystery that never quite resolves. The real Templars perished on scaffolds and rotted in cells. The mythical Templars, however, ride on still, forever armoured, forever cloaked in secrecy, galloping through the imagination of every generation. In that peculiar sense, Philip the Fair failed after all. He destroyed the men, but their legend proved beyond his reach. More than 7 centuries have now passed since the last Grand Master was burned upon that island in the Seine, and yet the Red Cross still lingers, in books, in stonework, in symbols cut into ancient walls and traded through modern conspiracy theories. The Templars are gone, but their legacy is anything but buried. They were far more than mere warriors. They were, in their way, innovators. In an age when kings still claimed to rule by the will of God, and lending money at interest was denounced as a sin, the Templars quietly assembled a pan-European network of finance, supply, and diplomacy. Their letters of credit foreshadowed the modern check, letting a pilgrim deposit coin in Paris and withdraw its value in the Holy Land. Their commanderies operated rather like the regional branches of a great multinational firm. They were, in short, an early sketch of globalization, drawn not with stock exchanges, but with swords and sacred vows. On the battlefield, too, they rewrote the meaning of knighthood. Before the Templars, chivalry had been a personal code, elastic and easily set aside when convenient. The Templars hardened it into an institution, a discipline imposed with unbending severity. They were not lone champions tilting for personal glory in the lists. They were tightly drilled units, trained something like the elite forces of a later age and prepared to die without hesitation for an abstract ideal. Die they often did, sometimes in silence, sometimes to no visible purpose, but never without leaving a mark. Culturally, they reshaped how the Christian West thought about the relationship between faith and violence. The very idea of the warrior monk challenged the old assumption that holiness and bloodshed could never share a soul. They demonstrated that belief itself could be forged into a weapon, wielded not only in war, but in politics, in finance, and in propaganda. And when at last they fell, it was that same power of belief, redirected against them in the form of accusations of heresy, that furnished the excuse for their destruction. Their downfall also served as a lasting cautionary tale. The Templars had become a symbol of power without accountability, answering to no earthly authority, sheltered by the Pope, and richer than the crowned heads around them. Their sudden ruin exposed how fragile even the mightiest institution could be, however thickly it wrapped itself in divine sanction. It was, in effect, a medieval corporate takedown, engineered not by disgruntled shareholders, but by a king and a pope acting in concert. Today their image is far more myth than man, but myths are what shape memory, and the memory of the Templars, courageous, flawed, and betrayed, reminds us that history is not written in triumphs alone. Sometimes it is inscribed in ashes. So the next time a red cross on a white field catches the eye, it is worth recalling that it was once worn by men who believed themselves to be doing the work of God, right up until ambition, politics, and fear decided otherwise. And out of that collision of steel, of gold, and of fire, a legend was born that has never once been extinguished. In the Paris of the 12th century, the whole world seemed to be shifting on its foundations. Trade routes were stretching farther than ever, universities were beginning to rise, and the church was flexing its authority with a confidence it had rarely shown before. It was an age drunk on ambition, political, spiritual, and architectural all at once. And at the very heart of this swelling city, a dream was taking shape, a dream made entirely of stone. That dream belonged to Maurice de Sully, appointed Bishop of Paris in the year 1160. He was not merely a churchman, he was a man of vision. The cathedral that already stood, the aging church of Saint-Étienne, had grown crumbling and unremarkable, hardly a fitting emblem for a city on the rise. Paris was outgrowing itself, and de Sully believed its spiritual heart ought to match its swelling ambition. So he dreamed on a far grander scale. He proposed a cathedral so vast and so overwhelming that it would dwarf everything around it, a monument raised not only to the Virgin Mary, but to the sheer power and glory of the Catholic Church in France. It would not be another squat Romanesque fortress like those that had come before. It would be something new, something daring, something Gothic. In 1163, that vision began to become real. Tradition holds that Pope Alexander III himself laid the very first stone during a ceremonial blessing. Work commenced at the eastern end, on the choir and the apse, where priests would one day chant their hymns beneath soaring arches of glass and stone. But this was no ordinary construction project. Notre Dame was a commitment measured not in years but in generations. And so the people of Paris set to work, the stonemasons and blacksmiths, the carpenters and artists all bending to the task. They dragged limestone from nearby quarries, dressed it with simple medieval tools, and threw up scaffolding that seemed to claw at the sky. Every block was set by hand. Every carving, every window, every rib of the vaulting was shaped with patience, with faith, and with a great deal of sweat. It would take decades merely to finish the earliest sections. The labourers toiled, knowing full well they would never live to see the towers completed. Sons took up the chisels their fathers had laid down. Whole lifetimes came and went, while Notre Dame rose slowly, magnificently, above the rooftops of Paris. For Bishop de Sully, however, the purpose was never in doubt, to raise a house of God so overwhelming that simply to step inside it would humble the proudest soul. Notre Dame was never meant to be merely a church. It was to be an act of worship carved directly into stone, a testament to what human hands could achieve when they reached deliberately for heaven. The first stone was only the beginning. What came next would reshape both the skyline and the very spirit of medieval Europe. As the 1170s unfolded, Notre Dame began to rise, not simply as a structure, but as a statement. In a city of cramped timber houses and mud-choked lanes, the cathedral gradually assumed its shape, looming over everything like a sermon rendered in stone. The Gothic style, still young and unproven, was about to overturn every assumption of what a church could be, transforming it from a mere shelter for prayer into an instrument of awe. The work advanced from east to west, beginning with the choir, where the clergy would one day perform their sacred rites, and then moving on to the nave, the great open expanse meant for the ordinary faithful. The engineering behind it was nothing short of revolutionary. The walls grew thinner, the ceilings climbed higher, and the pointed arches redirected the crushing weight downward in a way the old builders had never managed. Those ribbed vaults did not merely hold up the roof. They seemed to leap upward, drawing the eye, and with it the soul, toward heaven itself. Perhaps the boldest idea of all was light. Unlike the gloomy Romanesque churches of the past, Notre Dame was designed to glow. Vast stained glass windows began to appear, straining daylight into panels of coloured radiance and sacred geometry. Scenes from Scripture flared into life with the rising sun, so that the church was no longer merely telling its holy stories, it was illuminating them. Nothing in Notre Dame was without meaning. The columns were not simply supports, they stood for saints. The archways were not mere ornament, they were understood as passages toward salvation. The stone itself was a kind of theology, and the masons were its patient scribes. Beyond the walls, meanwhile, Paris was being transformed in turn. Notre Dame was becoming far more than a building, it was becoming the very soul of the city. Yet the progress remained painfully slow. There were no cranes and no machines, only muscle, wooden scaffolding, and an endless supply of resolve. Hundreds of workers laboured on year after year, and whenever one fell, another quietly stepped into his place. Their names went largely unrecorded, for their reward was never fame, but faith. They built not for themselves, but for God, and for generations yet unborn. By the year 1200, the choir and much of the nave stood complete, and the outline of something like a miracle was becoming visible. Notre Dame was no longer a dream. It was stone and glass, sweat and prayer. And even as the structure reached ever higher, so too did the ambitions of the men who raised it, for what they intended to attempt next would seem to defy both gravity and reason. Notre Dame was already unlike anything the city had ever known, yet it was also perilously ambitious. As the walls climbed and the vaulted ceilings spread wider, a serious problem revealed itself: the weight. The heavy stone ceilings did not press only downward, but outward as well, straining against the walls that held them. The higher the vaults rose, the more fiercely they threatened to shove those walls apart. The old Romanesque churches had solved this quietly, with thick walls and small windows. But Notre Dame had been built to breathe, to shine, and to reach toward the heavens in both spirit and in space. It was at this point that the stonemasons reached for something genuinely daring. They took hold of an architectural idea barely tested anywhere at the time, and they committed to it completely. The flying buttress. These were no ordinary props. They were external arms of stone, curving out from the high walls and reaching down to sturdy piers that stood a little apart from the main body of the building. Like the bones of a wing, they braced the cathedral from the outside, catching the outward thrust of that immense ceiling and carrying it safely down into the earth, where it could do no damage. Seen from the ground, they looked almost impossibly slender, as though someone had spun lace out of limestone. In truth, they were a triumph of engineering, and they allowed Notre Dame to become the thing it had always aspired to be, a structure made of air, of light, and of height that should not have been possible. That single innovation changed everything. Once the weight was lifted off the interior walls, those walls no longer had to be thick and solid to hold the roof aloft. The builders could open them up and pour in even more glass. The great rose windows, enormous wheels of coloured glass filled with saints, angels, and scenes of the last days, stopped being a distant fantasy and became something real that a visitor could stand beneath. Colour flooded into the sacred space. And the old stories of Scripture now arrived not only from the mouth of a preacher, but from the sunlight itself, filtered and painted as it passed through the glass. There is a quiet irony in all of this. The earliest plans for Notre Dame did not include flying buttresses at all. The first generation of Gothic builders had not yet understood how much these devices could do. But as the walls climbed higher, the strain grew heavier, and the masons had to improvise while the work was still in progress. They began fixing these stone wings onto the structure in the early 1200s, turning a structural emergency into something close to poetry. Opinion at the time was divided. Some observers thought the exposed supports were ungainly, a clutter of struts that spoiled the clean lines of the building. Most, though, simply looked up in astonishment. Notre Dame seemed to be held aloft by stone angels caught in mid-flight. The cathedral was no longer only a house of worship. It had become a working demonstration of what faith and mathematics could accomplish together, a hymn carved into limestone that seemed to defy gravity, and its wings were only beginning to open. By the early 1200s, the cathedral had already reshaped the skyline of Paris, yet its most recognizable features were still unfinished. As the eastern end neared completion, the effort turned toward the west. What would rise there was destined to become the face of Notre Dame, the part that most people would picture first, whenever they thought of it. The twin towers and the Great Western Front. This facade was never meant to be merely a way in. It was a declaration, at once spiritual, architectural, and political. The church intended you to feel small as you drew near, and it succeeded. The doors climbed to heights that seemed absurd. Above them, ranks of carved kings, prophets, saints, and demons looked down on everyone who approached. You were not simply stepping into a building. You were walking into the presence of judgment itself. Work on the western towers began around the 1220s, and, like everything else here, it dragged on for decades. Each tower rose in stages. one course of stone atop another, climbing steadily until they reached almost 70 meters. And yet, even so, they were never finished as the original design had imagined them. There were no spires, no slender needles crowning their summits, only broad flat tops that gave the front its calm, unhurried strength, majestic precisely because it was so plain. Between the two towers ran the Gallery of Kings, a row of 28 statues representing the ancient monarchs of Judah from the Old Testament. Centuries later, during the French Revolution, they would be mistaken for kings of France and, in a fit of anger, dragged down and beheaded by the crowds. But in the 13th century they carried a very different message: divine right, heavenly order, sacred authority. Church and crown walked side by side, and this was the porch on which they stood together. Below the gallery, 3 great doorways worked as theology told in stone. The central one, the portal of the Last Judgment, showed Christ enthroned in glory, surrounded by angels, by demons, and by the dead climbing up out of their graves. For a population that mostly could not read, these carvings were never decoration. They were doctrine you could see with your own eyes. The lesson was unmistakable. Enter with reverence. Eternity begins at this threshold. Above the doors a rose window opened out, nearly 10 meters across, ringed by delicate stone tracery and framed by figures of the Virgin Mary and her child. Light poured through the tinted glass like a spotlight sent from heaven, scattering the images of saints across the floor of the nave. By the middle of the 1200s the towers were close to done, and the western front stood complete, solemn, balanced, and overwhelming. It was a fortress of belief, an advertisement for the authority of God, and a warning aimed squarely at the sinner. Even so, the builders were not finished. The core of Notre Dame still needed to be brought to life, the transept, the roof, and one day the spire that would rise into the clouds. They had shaped its face, now they would give it a crown. With the towers and the western front standing in open defiance of gravity, Notre Dame was becoming more than an empty shell. It needed something living inside it. And that living heart lay within the great length of its nave, its 2 transept arms, and its sacred choir. These were the spaces meant to hold the chanting of monks, the footsteps of kings, and the prayers of ordinary thousands. By the mid-1200s the work had shifted to the transepts, the arms of the cross-shaped plan that gave every Gothic cathedral its distinctive floor. Under the architect Jean de Chelles, and later Pierre de Montreuil, these wings were extended and dressed with new rose windows even finer than the ones on the west. The northern window bathed its side of the church in cool blues and deep, heavenly purples. The southern was warmer, more like fire and no less divine. These were not idle choices of colour. They were belief expressed in light. The northern window stood for the Old Testament, the southern for the New, so that the 2 arms of the church between them told the whole story of salvation, one wing lit in coolness, the other in flame. Within the walls the columns rose like the trunks of trees in a forest of stone. The vaulted ceiling stretched almost 35 meters overhead, their ribbed arches meeting far above like hands joined in prayer. This was less architecture than choreography, an unbroken upward movement designed to draw the soul toward heaven. And then there was the altar, the sacred center of it all. Here the Mass was celebrated. Here holy relics were venerated. And here the great of France came to kneel. Royal weddings, coronation masses, visits from popes, Notre Dame slowly became the spiritual stage on which the nation itself performed. Yet it was never the property of the powerful alone. The ordinary people came too, merchants and peasants and pilgrims, and the cathedral turned into a public sanctuary filled with sermons and songs and the occasional scolding delivered from the pulpit. It was a place where one might come to witness a miracle or simply to beg for one. Every surface inside had a story to tell. The sculptures, the stained glass, even the patterned tiles of the floor. Notre Dame did not merely shelter the divine, it performed it. Faith was everywhere at once, cut into stone, drifting in incense, glowing out of glass. By the closing years of the 13th century, the interior was very nearly complete. The heart of the cathedral was beating strongly. But one thing was still missing, a crown to reach up into the heavens. And so they began to build the spire. Toward the end of the 1200s, Notre Dame already looked like something impossible. Its towers soared, its nave rang with sacred chant, its rose windows drenched the interior in coloured light. And yet a sense of incompleteness lingered. The cathedral had a face, a heart and wings, but no crown, no single vertical stroke to lead the eye up past the roofline and onward into the sky. So plans took shape for a spire. Unlike the twin towers, which were heavy and firmly rooted, the spire was to be light and elegant, a slender needle rising straight from the crossing of the transept, exactly at the centre of the church's cruciform plan. Built from oak and sheathed in lead, this first spire was at once a technical gamble and a statement of belief. It was no mere ornament. It was the exclamation point of Notre Dame, its most visible prayer. Its making called for master carpenters and skilled metalworkers. Oak beams were hauled up by human muscle, by winches and pulleys and forests of scaffolding. The whole thing had to be light and yet steady enough to stand against the winds that came sweeping off the Seine. When it was done, the spire cut into the sky like a sword raised in devotion. And beneath it, work of even greater intricacy was underway. Gargoyles, those strange and haunting creatures, seemed to grow out of the stone. They were not grotesque merely for amusement. Many of them served as waterspouts, throwing rainwater clear of the masonry so it could not eat away at the walls. Others were symbolic, guardians meant to scare off evil or reminders to the sinner of exactly what was waiting for him. This final phase also added dozens of chimeras, statues of hybrid beasts perched high above the rooftops of Paris, their carved eyes fixed forever on the horizon. They were nightmare and marvel folded together, a perfect expression of the Gothic fondness for mystery and hidden meaning. Inside, the side chapels were finished, the choir stalls carved, the relics set into their shrines. Notre Dame was now fully working, a sacred machine and a national stage all at once. It had taken more than a century of labour, tens of thousands of hands, and the faith of an entire kingdom. By 1345, close to 200 years after the first stone was laid, the cathedral was regarded as complete. But complete was never quite the right word. Notre Dame was never something frozen in time. It would be restored, reimagined, and raised up again across the centuries. Still, by the 14th century, the structure itself was finished. The Gothic age had built its masterpiece. By the middle of the 14th century, Notre Dame de Paris was no longer simply a cathedral. It was the cathedral, a towering emblem of Catholic power, royal authority, and national identity. For the 4 centuries that followed, it stood not only as the heart of Paris, but as the stage on which the great dramas of France would play out. It became the beating centre of the state religion, host to coronations, royal marriages, and solemn funerals. When kings wed, they did so beneath its vaults. When war was declared or a victory celebrated, the bells of Notre Dame rang out loud across the Seine. Monarchs walked in as rulers of the land and walked out as the chosen of God, Yet it was not kings alone who passed through those enormous doors. Generals, bishops, and foreign envoys came here to kneel or to negotiate. And when catastrophe struck, famine, plague, invasion, the people of Paris filled the nave with prayers and processions, desperate for some sign of divine mercy. The cathedral became a refuge for both hope and fear, always watching, always waiting. In political terms, Notre Dame became the spiritual anchor of the French monarchy. Its position on the Aile de la Cité, at the literal and symbolic heart of Paris, made it the ideal backdrop for the theatre of power. Priests blessed the banners of armies before they marched. The crown was tied not merely to royal blood but to a mandate from heaven. If the king ruled France, then Notre Dame ruled his soul. Culturally, too, it remained a place of wonder. Pilgrims travelled for miles simply to catch sight of its sacred relics, among them the crown of thorns, believed to have been worn by Christ himself. Its great organ thundered on feast days. Its choirs rang with polyphonic music that pushed at the very limits of what medieval composers had dared. Notre Dame did not stand still. It kept absorbing new fashions in art, new traditions in music, new forms of liturgy. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, its Gothic beauty had begun to fall out of favour. Baroque taste was the vogue, and Notre Dame, dark, spiky and unmistakably medieval, came to seem old-fashioned. A few renovations even tried to modernise its appearance, smoothing away what had once been so bold. Still it stood, a cathedral caught between the centuries, revered and yet increasingly overlooked. Its towers weathered the storms and the years, its bells still tolled, but something was stirring beneath its foundations. Notre Dame had been born of faith and crowned by kings. Soon it would meet a force that even stone could not ignore: revolution. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Notre Dame de Paris found itself on the wrong side of history. For centuries it had stood as a monument to monarchy and to religion, the two institutions. The revolution was most determined to sweep away. Almost overnight, the cathedral that had once crowned kings was recast as a symbol of oppression, and symbols, in the middle of a revolution, rarely come through unharmed. The assault was both ideological and physical. Revolutionaries poured into the cathedral. The statues of biblical kings that lined the facade were taken for kings of France, and all 28 were beheaded. Sculptures were shattered, altars were desecrated. The great bells that had once tolled for royal births and papal visits were hauled down and melted to make cannon. Precious relics, the crown of thorns among them, were carried off and hidden away, and many were simply lost. What was left behind was a hollow shell. In 1793, Notre Dame was formally deconsecrated. It was no longer a church. Instead, it was rebranded as the so-called Temple of Reason, borrowed by the Revolution for secular festivals that celebrated enlightenment rather than heaven. For a stretch it served an even humbler purpose, standing in as a warehouse where the new republic stored its wine. The great nave, which had for centuries carried the sound of chanting and organ music, now carried the smell of spilled barrels and cold, damp stone. The spire, already weakened and rotting, was eventually taken down piece by piece because it was no longer safe to leave it standing. Gargoyles worked loose and dropped from their high ledges. The roof let in the rain. Rats moved freely through the crypt below. To a passer-by it might have seemed that Paris had misplaced its own heart, leaving only a hollow, forgotten ruin at the very centre of the city. And yet, against every reasonable expectation, the building endured. When Napoleon rose to power, he he understood something the revolutionaries had overlooked. He saw that Notre Dame carried a symbolic weight no new hall could match, and that such weight could be borrowed. In 1804, he chose the cathedral as the stage for his own coronation as emperor. The interior was reconsecrated and tidied just enough to host a suitably lavish ceremony, though few present mistook the occasion for genuine piety. It was less an act of devotion than a piece of carefully arranged theatre. In the most quoted moment of all, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and set it on his own head, sparing himself the indignity of receiving it from anyone. Notre Dame once again lent its grandeur to the powerful, only this time stripped of the sacred meaning it had once held so naturally. Still, decades of neglect had left deep marks that no single afternoon of pageantry could erase. By the 1830s, the cathedral was decaying in both body and spirit, its stones cracked, its statues broken, its future genuinely in doubt. On more than one occasion, it was quietly marked for demolition. There were Parisians who argued without much sentiment that the city would be better served by something modern in its place, something lighter and less medieval, less shadowed by the weight of the past. And then a writer intervened. A writer who could look past the crumbling masonry and the mutilated saints and recognize something enduring underneath, something well worth rescuing. For just as the world had nearly resolved to forget Notre Dame, Victor Hugo made it impossible to look away. In 1831, a novel appeared in the bookshops that would end up saving an entire cathedral. Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, known to English readers as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was more than a Gothic tale of doomed love. Woven through it was an impassioned argument for preservation itself. Through the eyes of Quasimodo, the misshapen and half-deaf bell ringer, Hugo transformed the building from a mere backdrop into a living presence on the page, wounded, misunderstood, and strangely beautiful in its ruin. The public, to Hugo's evident satisfaction, actually listened. The story moved readers across France, and almost overnight ordinary Parisians grasped what they had come so close to losing. Notre Dame was not simply old and inconvenient. It was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of faith and patient craftsmanship that no committee could ever reproduce. The outcry did its work. By 1844, King Louis-Philippe approved a full restoration of the cathedral, and the task fell to two architects, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. Their ambition ran well beyond simple repair. They set out to recover the very soul of the place. They carved fresh statues to replace those worn to featureless stumps, rebuilt the famous Gallery of Kings whose figures a revolutionary mob had once beheaded, and reimagined the spire that had been dismantled during the Revolution. This new spire, designed by Viollet-le-Duc, rose 96 meters above the pavement, taller and more elaborately worked than the one it replaced. In time, it became one of the most recognizable outlines anywhere in Europe, a shape people could picture with their eyes shut. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, Notre Dame settled back into its proper role as the spiritual and cultural heart of Paris. It held masses and state funerals, witnessed the ceremonies of liberation, and welcomed millions of visitors who came simply to stand beneath its vaults and look up. It lived through 2 world wars. During the Nazi occupation, its great bells fell silent, and when Paris was at last freed in 1944, they rang out again in triumph, their sound carrying across a city that had feared it might never hear them so. But tragedy had not quite finished with the cathedral. On the 15th of April 2019, a fire broke out beneath the roof. Within minutes, the flames took hold of the dense wooden lattice the builders had nicknamed the Forest, some of its beams cut from oaks in the 13th century. The fire burned for hours. the roof caved in. The 19th century spire toppled in a slow column of smoke, while the world watched live as one of humanity's greatest monuments seemed to be vanishing in real time. And yet, once more, it survived. The stone towers held their ground. The rose windows came through unbroken. The relics were carried out to safety, and the people of France, together with much of the world, resolved to rebuild what the fire had taken. Notre Dame has always been far more than architecture. It is memory, identity, and endurance folded into stone, at once a church, a symbol, and a survivor. In every fresh block hoisted up from its own ashes, it repeats a quiet lesson that faith and beauty can be made again. She was born in 1775 in the coastal province of Guangdong in southern China. The name her family gave her was never written down, and so history knows her only by a borrowed title, Zheng Yi Sao, meaning the wife of Zheng Yi. What she managed to do with that borrowed name would eventually rattle empires. In her earliest years, she worked aboard a Cantonese floating brothel, one of the few paths open to a poor girl on that stretch of 18th century coast. These floating establishments, politely called flower boats, served a passing trade of merchants, naval officers, and pirates. But she was not quite like the other women aboard. She paid attention. She watched who came and went, remembered the names, and coaxed powerful visitors into saying more than they intended. In time, she became something more valuable than mere company. She became a broker of information, and information in that world was a kind of currency. Then came Zheng Yi, a formidable pirate lord who commanded the Red Flag Fleet, among the most powerful pirate confederations in the whole South China Sea. He was not the first pirate she had known, but he would be the last. Taken with her sharpness and her cunning, Zheng Yi offered marriage. She accepted, though not without conditions. In a move almost unheard of for a woman in her position, she negotiated the terms of the union itself. She wanted genuine joint command of the fleet, not the ornamental role of a captain's wife, but an equal share of the partnership. She would manage political alliances, oversee the division of plunder, and hold a voice in every important decision. Zheng Yi agreed. Whether he did so out of affection or cold calculation hardly mattered, because either way he understood that she was an asset no rival could match. Their marriage in 1801 marked the beginning of one of the most successful pirate dynasties the seas have ever produced. Zheng Yi Sao wasted no time embedding herself in the intricate politics of piracy. She studied the hierarchies, the old rivalries, and the unwritten codes that held that lawless world loosely together. While her husband sailed out to raid and conquer, she quietly assembled networks, recruited useful allies, and learned to govern from behind the curtain. She did not remain behind it for long. When Zheng Yi died suddenly in 1807, possibly swept overboard in a typhoon, most observers assumed his empire would splinter. Dozens of ambitious captains waited to fall on the fleet, confident that a power vacuum had opened. What they encountered instead was a swift and deliberate seizure of control. Zheng Yi Sao stepped into command not by raw force but by strategy. She took firm hold of the Red Flag Fleet, reinforced the alliances her husband had built, and married Zheng Yi's adopted son and chief lieutenant, Chung Po Tsai, a match that secured both personal loyalty and military muscle in a single stroke. In less than 10 years she had travelled from the flower boats to the head of a pirate nation, and she was only beginning. When she assumed command in 1807, she inherited not merely a fleet, but a floating kingdom. Rather than watching it fracture after her husband's death, she drew it tighter and made it stronger still. Under her rule, the Red Flag Fleet did more than survive. it multiplied. The South China Sea had endured pirates for generations, but what Zhong Yisao now directed was without precedent. She oversaw an armada of more than 300 ships, a figure that swelled past 600 within a year. Some accounts credit her, at her height, with over 1,800 vessels and as many as 70,000 men, a force larger than the combined navies of several European powers of the day. She achieved this through a blend of ruthless practicality and a shrewd grasp of what made pirates tick. She held her authority not through fear alone, but by building a system that tied every captain's fortunes to her own. She laid down a strict code of laws covering nearly every aspect of pirate life, from the sharing of loot to loyalty, discipline, and punishment. Disobedience met with swift and unpleasant consequences. Anyone caught skimming from the common treasury lost his head. A pirate who mistreated a female captive without permission was put to death. A deserter had his ears cut off and was marched before the assembled fleet as a living warning to the rest. But it was never governed by fear alone. Zhong Yisao offered her followers protection, structure, and reliable profit. Her code let each pirate keep a fair portion of the spoils, roughly 20%, while the remainder flowed into a communal fund she managed herself. That shared treasury was no idle hoard. From it came the money to repair battered ships, provision the fleet, pay quiet bribes to sympathetic officials, and support the widows and children of men lost in battle. This gave every man a genuine stake in the enterprise and knit loyalty together through sheer stability. Even beaten rivals and the folk of raided villages frequently chose to join her rather than resist. She split the enormous fleet into 6 squadrons, each marked by a colour: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green, yet all of them answering, in the end, to her. Her closest confidant and second in command, Chung Po Tsai, led the Red Squadron, her elite corps. Under her direction, piracy took on the shape of a government in its own right, with taxes, defence, and a clear chain of command. She controlled sea lanes stretching from Vietnam to Hong Kong, taxed the flow of trade, raided imperial outposts, and collected tribute from coastal towns as though it were her lawful due. Villages that paid for her protection were largely left to manage their own affairs. Those that refused took their chances against a fleet that did not bluff. The Qing dynasty had a navy. Zhong Yisao had an empire, and it was still growing. She ruled not by charm alone, but by rules, and iron ones at that. The popular picture of pirates as drunken, disorderly rogues had little to do with her fleet, which behaved less like a mob of outlaws than a tightly run corporation. At the centre of it all sat her pirate code, an exacting body of law that turned mayhem into method. This was no romantic scroll passed hand to hand by candlelight. It was blunt, binding, and enforced without hesitation, and every captain and deckhand understood exactly what was at stake. To break it invited humiliation at the least and execution at the worst. One of its most notorious clauses governed the division of plunder. After a raid, all captured goods had to be brought before the fleet's central storehouse. The pirate who seized them received a fifth, while the rest fed the collective pool, and to steal from that pool was to forfeit one's life. Cowardice in battle, abandoning one's squadron or ignoring orders, could earn a flogging, an execution, or a one-way trip over the side, and desertion meant losing one's head on the spot. The code even reached into matters of the heart, insisting that any woman taken captive be treated with respect on pain of beheading. Zhong Yisao had no appetite for chaos. She wanted control, and the code delivered it, binding her followers not only to her as a leader, but to the whole orderly system she had come to embody. Still, the pressure kept building. By the year 1809, an unlikely alliance had formed against her, drawing together the naval power of the Qing dynasty, the ships of Portugal operating out of Macau, and a fleet raised by wealthy Cantonese merchants who had grown weary of paying tribute to the sea. Together they closed in on sections of her armada, hoping to strangle the Red Flag fleet in a coordinated squeeze. And yet, even hemmed in on several sides, Zheng Yisao proved impossible to hold. She fought them off, pulled her ships back when the numbers demanded it, and then struck again from unexpected angles, launching counterattacks that left her better equipped enemies bewildered. She was not merely clinging to survival, she was making a point. Each escape, each reversal, chipped away at the dignity of an empire that could not seem to bring one woman to heel. But the truth of prolonged warfare is that it exhausts even the victorious. Every skirmish drained her stores of powder and rice, wore down her crews, and thinned the reserves that had once seemed bottomless. A pirate confederation, however vast, cannot wage war on endless fronts forever. Zheng Yisao understood this better than anyone. Undefeated at sea though she remained, she grasped a lesson that eluded many conquerors before her. Power is not always measured by winning every engagement. Sometimes the wisest use of strength is knowing the precise moment to step away with everything you value still in your hands. She had no intention of perishing on a burning deck, and still less of being marched in chains before a Qing magistrate. She had another design in mind, one that would leave her adversaries as astonished as any cannonade ever had. By 1810, she had accomplished something that ought to have been impossible. She had withstood the combined might of the Qing dynasty, embarrassed foreign navies in their own waters, and reigned over the sea lanes with an authority no rival could match. But she was, above all, a realist. Wars fought against a growing list of enemies could not be sustained indefinitely. Supplies were dwindling, alliances between her captains grew brittle, and her fleet, still enormous, was beginning to feel the slow grind of attrition. So she did what few outlaws in history have had the composure to do. She changed the game entirely. Zheng Yisao opened negotiations with the Qing government, not as a fugitive pleading for her life, but as one power addressing another. And she came to the table with terms, remarkably bold ones. She knew exactly what leverage she held. The empire had tried and failed to defeat her by force. Along the coast, ordinary people feared her name more than they respected the distant throne. That gave her the standing to bargain, not as a criminal begging for clemency, but as the head of what amounted to a maritime state. She sailed to Guangzhou herself, aboard her own vessel, ringed by armed guards, the colours of the Red Flag fleet flying openly above her. This was no surrender crawled to on bended knee. It was a calculated display of strength, a reminder to the imperial officials of precisely whom they were dealing with. Her demands matched her confidence. She requested a full pardon, and not only for herself, but for the entire fleet beneath her. Thousands upon thousands of pirates, from grizzled captains to the women and children who had lived their whole lives on the water. She insisted on keeping the fortune she had amassed through years of plunder and protection rackets, and she asked with characteristic nerve that her second-in-command and husband, Chung Po Tsai, be given a proper rank as an officer in the very navy that had spent years hunting them. The imperial court was taken aback by the audacity of it, but behind the shock lay a quiet truth of their own. They, too, were tired. The treasury could not stretch to another long and bloody campaign against an enemy that refused to be beaten. And so, in a rare and clear-eyed moment of pragmatism, the Qing authorities agreed. Zheng Yisao surrendered, but she did so entirely on her own terms and with a sense of theatre befitting her reign. On the 18th of April, 1810, she led more than 17,000 of her followers, men, women, and children alike, into the city, not shackled and shamed, but moving in something closer to a procession. More than 200 ships were handed over. Weapons were laid down in ceremony rather than seized in defeat. The great pirate confederation dissolved itself without a single drop of blood spilled in the transfer. There were no mass trials, no executions on the wharf, no confiscation of her hard-won riches. Cheung Po Tsai received his captaincy in the Qing Navy exactly as she had demanded. And Zheng Yisao herself retired a free woman, untouched by punishment, undefeated in battle, and still extraordinarily wealthy. In a world where nearly every pirate story ends in betrayal, a noose, or a shallow grave, hers ended in negotiation and comfortable retirement. She had played the long game to perfection, first with cannon fire and boarding hooks, and then, when the moment called for it, with patience and words. And as her red banners were lowered for the last time over Guangzhou, her legend was not fading. It was only beginning to take shape. After brokering the largest pirate surrender in recorded history, she walked away, not as a hunted outlaw, but as a respected and prosperous woman, her fortune and her reputation both intact. Following the disbanding of the fleet in 1810, she settled in Canton, the city known today as Guangzhou, alongside Cheung Po Tsai, now an officer of the Imperial Navy. The leap from pirate admiral to respectable citizen might strike the observer as absurd. For Zheng Yisao, it was simply one more act of careful, deliberate survival. She lived openly and in ease, and the Qing authorities, perhaps relieved to be rid of her at sea, largely left her in peace. Rather than vanishing quietly into a private old age, she reinvented herself once more, this time as a woman of business. She ran a gambling house, and she oversaw an operation smuggling opium along the coast, ventures that were technically outside the law but generally overlooked, given how much influence she still commanded. She was not trying to raise a second empire, but she had no intention of allowing herself to be forgotten either. She held on to her network of connections, guarded her wealth carefully, and lived precisely as she pleased. Her marriage to Cheung Po Tsai endured, and together they raised a family. While he sailed for the Qing Navy, hunting down pirates who were, ironically, not so different from the people they themselves had once been, she managed their commercial interests on land. She moved among the region's elite, was consulted on matters of the sea, and remained a figure of near mythic status among the sailors and merchants of the South China coast. What makes her remarkable is not simply that she survived, but the manner in which she lived. She broke nearly every expectation her society had fixed upon a woman. Born into poverty and sold into a brothel, she had clawed her way to the summit of a brutal, male-dominated criminal world. Then, instead of dying in a sea battle or on an executioner's platform, she stepped aside peacefully and lived on to die of old age in 1844, at the age of 69. She sought no redemption, and by her own reckoning she needed none. Her entire life stood as a quiet rebuttal to every law, custom, and expectation that had been laid before her. In an age when women were scarcely permitted to speak in public, she had commanded fleets, dictated the terms of treaties, and bargained face to face with the servants of an emperor. And then she left it all behind, richer and freer than any pirate the world had known. History readily remembers the likes of Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Henry Morgan, men who prowled the Caribbean, spread disorder, and generally came to violent ends. Yet standing in the long shadow of their infamy is Zheng Yisao, not merely their equal, but, by almost every honest measure, their superior. She did not captain a lone ship. She directed entire fleets. She did not raid a scattering of coastal villages. She controlled whole stretches of the sea. And she did not swing from a gibbet or fall in a gunfight. She negotiated her own passage out of piracy and into a long and settled peace. Among the great names of pirate lore, she remains at once the most accomplished and the least understood. Her success owed little to mere luck or cruelty. It rested on strategy, sharp intelligence, and a profound grasp of how power actually works. She was tactician, politician, and shrewd reader of human nature all at once. She held her people's loyalty, partly through fear certainly, but also through order, fair reward, and a carefully engineered system of rules that gave her floating world its structure. What set her further apart still was that she achieved all of it as a woman in Qing-era China, a society steeped in Confucian ideals that assigned women to silence and service. Women were not expected to command in the marketplace, let alone upon the open sea. Zheng Yisao did not merely test that boundary, she shattered it completely, earning the respect of hardened captains, forcing the Qing throne to the negotiating table, and closing her days as a business owner and family matriarch. She did not lean upon a man's legacy. She seized one, enlarged it, and made it wholly her own. In popular memory she lingers as something of a phantom, less celebrated than her male counterparts, rarely romanticized in Western storytelling, and too often left out of the mainstream histories altogether. Yet within maritime circles, and along the folklore of the Chinese coast, her name is still spoken with genuine awe. The red flag fleet may have dispersed, its sails furled forever, but the memory of her drifts on like a ghost ship, silent, untouchable, and larger than any single life. Part of the reason her story sits uneasily in the record is that it refuses to fit the familiar mold. She was no tragic anti-hero cut down in his prime like Blackbeard. She did not die in battle. She was not European. And, most unsettling of all to those who wrote the histories, she was a woman who thoroughly outmaneuvered an empire. That variety of power disturbs that tidy, male-centered narrative that chroniclers long preferred. In the official Qing records, she appears less as a subject worth studying than as a problem quietly resolved. The dynasty had no wish to celebrate the woman who had exposed the weakness of its navy, defied its authority, and then walked away unpunished. Even her success was an embarrassment to the throne. Western historians, for their part, did little better. For centuries, piracy had been dressed up through a European lens, all peg legs and rum and parrots and buried plunder. Zheng Yisao fit none of it. She was not swashbuckling, but calculating. She did not duel for glory, but negotiated for lasting power. She was not struck down by the state. She treated with it and prevailed. To many storytellers, that made her less thrilling than simply inconvenient. In recent decades, however, her legend has resurfaced, as scholars, historians, and enthusiasts of maritime history work to restore her rightful place. Documentaries, novels, and even video games have begun to acknowledge the pirate queen of the South China Sea. And still, much of her life remains wrapped in mystery. Her original given name is lost to us. Most of what survives comes filtered through the words of her enemies, Qing officials, foreign sailors, and later European observers. Yet even those fragments are enough to sketch the silhouette of a giant. She never wore a crown, and she never needed one. Her authority sprang not from a throne or a bloodline, but from command, from respect, from fear, from thousands of voices carrying her orders across the water. In every meaningful sense, she was a monarch, ruling a kingdom without borders, whose domain stretched from the Gulf of Tonkin to the shores of Guangdong. She built something no one had managed before or since, a pirate confederation that was not merely criminal, but genuinely political, organized and functional, governing trade routes, codes of law, and treaties across waters the empire itself struggled to hold. Few monuments bear her name today, but her presence still hangs over the South China Sea like a storm that never quite passed, proof that greatness does not wait for permission, and that even in a world built to silence women, a single sharp and unyielding voice could command an ocean and step away. By the time she died in 1844, she had done what no pirate, emperor or general had done before her. She let go of absolute power by her own choosing and carried her legend away undamaged, before the sea could claim it.